The legislative veto session ends this week. How many problems have they solved? We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Brian Mackey, State House reporter for NPR Illinois.
Hey, how you doing, Bruce?
Just fine, thanks for coming. And also Kent Redfield, a political science professor emeritus from University of Illinois, Springfield.
Good to be here.
Great. As we're taping this, the legislative session is winding down. There's at least one significant thing, or maybe significant thing, that has gone through the legislature as we're taping, and that has to do with consolidation of pension systems in downstate Illinois. This has been on the radar, so to speak, for a number of years in the legislature. This year, Governor Pritzker said he really wanted to get this done, and he has in fact gotten a bill through both houses and presumably will sign it. How big of a victory is this for the governor?
Well, I guess you could say it's a small step towards solidifying pensions in local government, but it's no great leap or giant leap, to further use that quote. It's no giant leap for the overall pension solvency of Illinois. The state university, state employees, and teachers still have a combined pension unfunded liability north of $130 billion with a B dollars.
Sure.
But this is a significant drag on a lot of local governments to have these, and we should talk a little about what we're talking about. Downstate and suburban police and fire departments have their own pension funds, and some of them are pretty well funded in the places you would guess where they have a lot of money coming into local government, and some of them in other places you would guess are pretty poorly funded.
Sure.
So the idea here is to take and pool their money, and by pooling it for the purpose of investment, and by doing that, hopefully drive up the investment returns, right? If you have $100 to put in the bank, you're only going to get a small amount of interest. If you had $100,000 to invest somewhere, you could invest in better investment vehicles, hopefully.
Right.
Individual governments will still have their own pools within this, so there were some concerns about, are the wealthy areas going to be bailing out the less funded areas? No, that is not the case. Everyone will have their own individual, or every unit of government will have an individual account. But it's something, and the governor is trying to make a lot of hay out of it because once again got a piece of his agenda through the legislature.
I mean, it's an economies of scale sort of
Right.
thing. But how realistic are the economies? I mean, folks were throwing out figures of as much as $500 million saved through doing this. Is that realistic? I mean, what at the end of the day, how much money is involved here in terms of savings over what we have now is kind of a somewhat disjointed system? This is less disjointed.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me consult my degree from the London School of Economics here. I seem to have misplaced it, unfortunately.
I think it was repossessed. But
Yeah, I mean, we'll see, I guess is the answer to that. Pension projections, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. If the economy goes south, all the pension investments are going to do poorly. As we've also seen an issue with pension funds chasing greater and greater returns, and getting into more exotic investment vehicles. If some of those go south, as happened with the Great Recession, then that'll hurt things. But people are optimistic right now. There was another piece of this, though, that does cost a little more money, which is what people are calling a fix or a modification to the Tier 2 pension benefits. This is for people, police and firefighters, again, in downstate and in the suburbs, hired after 2011. They got a lower set of pension benefits, less good pension benefits. There's a lot of concern, and not just for these employees, but state employees, university employees, and teachers as well, that these benefits are so modest and people are paying in so much to this but getting so little back that the Social Security Administration will eventually say, end the break that Illinois and other units of government get where they don't have to contribute to Social Security for people in these pension funds. And so the idea is here to hopefully bridge that divide. One of the things that got brought up is that, if you're a firefighter who has a pension and you're killed in the line of duty or something like that, there wasn't the same way to pass that on to your survivors as there would be for people who were hired before this change took place. So they do try to address some of these things. There will be a cost for that, and that will eat into some of the expected savings or additional money that people are looking for.
And clearly, we should say this is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in terms of dealing with a multitude of pension issues at the state and the local level, and a modest increase on your investment returns if you've got a pension fund that is, at about 15% or 10%, or some of them are even worse than that. This is not going to turn things around. I mean, if you are headed south, if you're in that bad a shape, getting a little more return on the money that you have, as you try, as pension costs put pressures on local government. If you hire less in fire and police, then you've got less active members paying into the funds. This is it is in some cases, some situations, is actually worse than what's going on at the state level. And so, it is nice to have, say, well, we can do it, sort of thing. But this was not a lot of tremendously heavy lifting in terms of, and certainly the people that are clamoring for a constitutional amendment to reduce benefits from current retirees, are not going to embrace this as.
It's not a fundamental sort of structural.
No.
I mean, on some level, watching what's happened, just hearing your folks' analysis, this wasn't a heavy lift on some. In some fact, some folks might describe it as somewhat a shiny balloon, because there's a lot of other things on the plate that, as we are recording this, the session is winding down, that haven't gotten done. I think at this point in time, Chicago has had some big asks. Number one, a casino. They need a legislative fix. They're saying doesn't look like it's going to happen. Should that be deemed a failure, and if so, who's to blame for it?
Too early to say at this point.
Okay,
as we are
point.
taping this on, I'm going to say on Thursday, full disclosure.
Fair point.
The legislature is still in session. I'm seeing
Okay, if you're a gambling man.
I'm seeing conflicting tweets coming. One person says it's dead because the mayor, there were all these other asks. As often happens with a gambling bill, it becomes a Christmas tree, right? The mayor of Chicago came to Springfield this week, had a small request. Fix some of the tax structure on this casino.
By itself, it's not that.
Right. It doesn't seem like that big a deal because the concern is there was a study this summer that was part of the law that said this casino that was approved in Chicago, the tax rates would be so onerous that it could be difficult to attract one of these private companies to step up and manage this thing. So change the tax structure. That's what the mayor wanted. Well, then there were reports that, DuPage County didn't really get anything out of the previous gambling bill, and they'd like a stream of money for their public health department. Capital Facts reported that. And there's all these other.
They have a perfectly good health department.
Well, and they have a lot of money in DuPage County as well. But you have all these other people come with their hands out.
Right.
And when this thing finally, after years, if not decades, of trying to pass a major gambling bill past this spring, you had the Capitol bill at the same time, which is billions of dollars in state spending. Okay, you're having a hard time voting for this. What if we, improve that school in your area? What if we improve the road in your area? Well, that money is now passed. That's accounted for. They don't have the sort of carrot to go with their attempt to push this, to lure the donkey through, just to use another torture metaphor.
Or elephant, as it may be.
And this is, insofar as we don't have the structure in place to produce the revenue from gambling, then that puts the construction, a lot of this was going to schools and rather than the roads, the vertical stuff, and that means that's pressure on the budget, and so we'd like to have all of these things taken care of so that the other parts of the budget can put money into the school aid formula, and so this is a big deal in terms of the whole budgeting and the whole projection of what we're going to be able to do. we have to get a lot of things right, and there are problems with gambling, and that just that gives us could be some a real pause. And so whose fault is it? Well, part of it is, as we often do in terms of very large pieces of legislation, they're huge and incredibly complex and done at the last minute. We don't get it right, and that's that's not any particular surprise. But when you have to have everything go right in order to get the kind of things that we're promising in terms of the long-term budget plan, then this is not a crisis yet, but it's serious if we don't work this out.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes about, and I think a lot of folks do too, Mayor Lightfoot. How is she getting? Things again with the huge caveat that the session isn't over yet, but the casino is in doubt at this point in time. She's asked for a real estate transfer tax authority, and that hasn't gone very far. Does she know how to play the game? And how big of a deal is that in terms of, can the mayor of Chicago, if it takes going into a smoke-filled room, can she negotiate it?
Yeah, that is the question out of this, and sort of the bigger picture question I think that this raises. And the answer to that is, well, we don't know yet. Sure. It's still early days, but what we do know is that when she came here in the spring, before she was even sworn in yet, she indicated that a lot of her plans for trying to restore the fiscal situation in Chicago go through Springfield.
Right.
The road to, I think there was a quote along the lines of, the road to Chicago's fiscal health runs through Springfield and through the state capitol in particular. Yeah. And she needs, as you mentioned, the real estate transfer tax. That was blocked by progressives from her own Democratic Party who want to make her follow through on one of her campaign pledges, which is to use the majority of that extra money to prevent homelessness and fight homelessness in the city. And she said in a news conference, not going to happen. Has other demands on that money now. And as we mentioned, the casino bill. So this, because so much of her agenda does require help from the General Assembly, there is a question. And I think it's worth noting, this is her first job in elective office. And so, as we've seen with other politicians who are new, Governor Pritzker being a notable exception, but sometimes they come in, they have grand ideas, and there's a bit of a learning curve as they try and adjust.
Pritzker being the notable exception who was caught on tape with Governor Blagojevich during the. Fair
enough.
Okay.
But in terms of getting an agenda through, we do sometimes see with the what our friend of the show Chris Mooney has called neophyte politicians coming in, and
the sky is blue. There's no possibility of limits, and
and you overestimate your mandate, maybe.
Right.
And we'll see what her learning curve is. But even with, we've given the governor lots of credit for getting a very aggressive agenda and putting some things in place. But she inherited an incredible fiscal mess, as did the governor. And all of the goodwill and all of the political skill in the world may not be sufficient to deliver on either Governor Pritzker's promises or Mayor Lightfoot's promises. It is you want to feel good about it. You want to feel optimistic, but the
mood was, we got the rascals out. It's a fresh face and someone who's smart, who's got progressive ideals. And where is she now?
Yeah, well, it is, it's kind of, you have to ask yourself, who exactly would want to be governor of the state of Illinois or mayor of Chicago, given what they were inheriting. And Pritzker has done very well in terms of putting something together that may work. Lightfoot is not there yet in terms of getting that through, and she's still got her first budget to go through. So, it is sometimes when you don't have the majority, or you got the legislature, you don't have the governor's office, you think, well, boy, if we just got everybody, if we just controlled all of government, we'd really be able to get things done. And it rarely works out that way. And I think it's going to be a lot of bumps in the city and a lot of bumps in Springfield.
Yeah. One thing also has been on the agenda during the fall session here is, and as we say, it's wrapping up as we speak, is things having to do with improving the ethical environment here in Springfield in the face of a number of raids by the FBI on high-level individuals, many of them connected to Michael Madigan, Exelon, ComEd. It looks stinky. It probably is stinky. And so what sorts of ethical things can we expect? Because right now we haven't really seen, I think, a lot in concrete about here's what we're going to do to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future.
We have, probably we are going to have passed today setting up a commission with appointments from the different legislative leaders, the constitutional officers, a mandate to get something out by, I think, March was
just after the primary.
Just after the primary, and we have seen this before.
Yes.
In fact, I testified and been in front of a couple of commissions after Rod Blagojevich was removed from office. And as I told someone, that we've got a lot of experience of pushing this very heavy rock up the hill, and a lot of experience with it rolling down back over the top of it.
And getting out of the way.
Yes. And so there certainly are specific proposals. Republicans have specific proposals. The Democrats have got some things on the table. Some of them actually have to do with ethics. Some of them have to do with, whatever the problem is, we have the solution. If it's corruption, the solution is legislative redistricting. Or if the problem is corruption, then we need to expand minority rights within the legislative process. I mean, but some of this does actually focus on, how do we harden the target? How do we make it more difficult to be corrupt? And how do we provide more exposure, more sunshine? And clearly, a lot of this is not new in terms of, that we need to more information. That information needs to be publicly disclosed about financial dealings, contributions, contracts, lobbying, and that we need to provide public access for it. And so personally, I'm encouraged that they are talking in the legislation about requiring the Secretary of State to produce a searchable database of all the information that he has on statements of economic interest, lobbying activity, all of those kinds of things. You would think that state government would have joined the digital age by 2019, but that sometimes is not the case. But the harder lifts are how do you deal with conflicts of interest? How do you deal with, it seems straightforward that lobbyists probably, sitting legislators probably shouldn't lobby, state government or local governments.
But they do and have.
Well, state government is already prohibited, I think.
Okay.
The local government, you do have Senate President John Cullerton is a registered lobbyist in the city of Chicago. He would say, well, that's because, he's not doing policy lobbying for the city, but if you have he's a lawyer, he works for a law firm. If you have a client that needs help with a permit or something like that, or you do anything in interfacing with government, a lot of people err on the side of registering.
I need help with a permit, so I call the president of the Senate to go lobby my local city council.
Apparently,
do you see a problem with that? Maybe
if you have enough money, you can hire the firm, I guess.
Okay.
But as Kent said, there are some things that breaking news did pass both the House and Senate, pretty modest measures.
All right,
there's the legislation mainly targets people who lobby state government. Set aside for now that the only people actually under indictment as we sit here are a current and former state legislator, not any of the lobbyists who have been investigated and had their papers searched and things like that.
They're in the suspicion cloud phase.
They're under the people of interest, or however the eufemism is in 2019. But It's actually lawmakers who have been accused of wrongdoing in federal court. But the legislation that passed targets people who lobby state government. They have to disclose whether they also lobby local government. They have to say whether they're elected or appointed to any government jobs. There's, for example, a Cook County commissioner who is an active lobbyist in state government. Never any hint of impropriety that I've heard there, but the fact remains. And there's, as Kent mentioned, this database that the Secretary of State's office, after the law is passed, would have 90 days to create this, that pulls in information from the State Board of Elections about how lobbyists are spending money on politicians, campaign contributions, with lobbyist registration information.
Okay.
Some of the statement of economic interest stuff, though, was stripped out. There were concerns about, how broadly written that was. So that's something that will be investigated by the task force.
Well, this might be a giant leap for the state legislature, but I'm not sure that it can be interpreted as a small step for anybody on some level here. Because if we're talking about disclosure, I mean, there's been all sorts of things for years that have been disclosed, and nothing, frankly, gets done about them. And Professor, you and I both, you do too. I mean, Frank Matino is still, nothing happened to him, although there were serious questions that still remain about his campaign spending. Luis Arroyo, I mean, this is not as big a deal, but there's a bright line prohibition on spending money on clothes from campaign funds, and he did it and wrote it down. It was fully disclosed, nothing happened to him. We have Patricia Van Pelt, the senator now, who is under some scrutiny because she last spring was, while she was co-sponsoring a cannabis bill, was running a side hustle or business, however you want to call it, saying, come pay a lot of money to come to a seminar and I'll show you how to get into the marijuana business. And so this sort of thing, and William Hain, also recently appointed the State Board of Elections, is involved in trying to move money around so that he still has control of it, even though he's on the State Board of Elections. These are loopholes to some extent that these folks are going through, and there's no public, I'm sorry to get on my soapbox here, but it's a culture sort of issue. It seems to me on some level. I don't know if you can do a letter of censure or some letter of commendation, but wouldn't it go to some distance? I mean, they did throw Luis Arroyo out of the legislature to their credit. But when something like a William Hain happens, or when something like a Van Pelt happens, and folks see that, is there or should there, or is it realistic to expect that there is some public statement by lawmakers saying this is not, regardless of the letter of the law, this is not the spirit? I mean, is that too much to ask?
Well, when you get down to, are there things where it's the purview of the legislative inspector general, or is it the State Board of Elections? And we have fines. And then if we're talking about sanctions involving the Lobbyist Registration Act or statements of economic interest, that becomes the Secretary of State. And so, it is, I would push back a little bit in that we really don't have the level of information from statements of economic interest about what people are involved with. And so we shouldn't have to find out after the fact that the President of the Senate, Republican leader in the Senate's got an interest in video gaming or whatever. You can't start saying we need to prohibit conflicts of interest if you don't know what the conflicts are.
But if it looks like a duck, acts like a duck, swims the whole thing, and nothing happens, and there's no statement.
Yeah, and part of this is it not being accessible because of the Secretary of State, the way that they've handled some of this information. And some of it is the fact that, this takes time and effort to get this stuff out. And as it happened this week, when we, essentially gut another downstate newspaper, the Champaign News Gazette, then you've got fewer bodies that are out there. And so, yes, we can, we need more information, we need to make it more accessible, but ultimately it's about culture. And if you go back to hiring the Senate President to go take care of your permit, that feeds into the public cynicism that, the people that get the breaks are the people that know the insiders or that have the money that can afford to, and so the system is rigged. And so this is where the appearance of corruption is every bit as corrosive as corruption itself. It is a huge problem that it periodically rears its head, and then we kind of the approach is generally, what can we do to make this go away, rather than how can we do the right thing. At least that's certainly been my experience.
And I'm running out of time, I know, but I think about what you said, and I'm reminded of what State Representative Tom Demmer, who's a Republican from Dixon, said during the debate today, or I should say on Thursday, that the cure for corruption in Illinois is not more paperwork. The cure for corruption is not a searchable database on the internet. And I think, Bruce, what I hear you talking about is the culture down here. And how you change that, that goes back more than a century, I think, in Illinois. And some states have a much stronger ethical culture. Illinois has a more flexible ethical culture, I guess you'd say. And how you begin to change that, well, that's where you get into some of the more, as Kent was saying, the things you sort of throw the bowl of spaghetti at the wall, where all the ideas people have about redistricting and sort of breaking the power that the leaders have and sort of democratizing. But some of these things just seem like they may be endemic.
Yeah, all points well taken. At some point when this comes up, and it does come up periodically, every few years it seems there's something stinky, and you just shake your head, or sometimes, how can, because it's just the way it is, and at some point it becomes, I don't know what the right adjective is, but it's disconcerting, I guess, at the very least.
You would think that a billionaire, though, if he wanted to make it a top priority, who was completely independent of the money power of the legislative leaders, can write his own check, and has the majorities, which is unlike the previous ultra-wealthy governor we had, did not have the legislative support, that if Governor Pritzker wanted to make this the big priority for 2020, really changing the culture and the ethics of Illinois government, that if he can't do it, who can?
Well, point well taken. And at that, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our program. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week on Capitol View.